Ash.
Beloved, we are learning to preach in a new way in this virtual format, in a way that keeps close our work of reparations, that does not leave that aside, that seeks to preach in a meaningful way and also a way that has some brevity to it, given this new format. So I ask, please will you pray with me in this new way? O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts together be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
So I think that many of us are familiar with the story of Lazarus. In the Gospel of John and in our own Lenten timeline, it comes just before the events of Holy Week and the death and resurrection of Jesus. It can be easy to roll those deaths into one. There is suffering, of course, but there is also resurrection. And the resurrection is what matters, we think. And yes, that joy to come is a beautiful thing. But I want to say it is also an empty husk, a shell of possibility if we refuse to enter the grief that comes before. This gospel passage is linked to so many elements. There is the pain of the family, the way in which they cry out to Jesus in desperation to save their brother. There's the way in which Jesus holds back, seemingly allowing Lazarus to die so that the miracle may be performed. There is the raising from the dead of this man, the part of the story that so often receives the most attention. We want the happy ending, especially right now. But I want to focus instead on two elements, one which is in the gospel passage and one which is written in the text of tradition. I'll start with the second, a knowing that has been carried in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, though it is not written in the text explicitly. And it is this, that for the 30-odd years that Lazarus survived and lived after that first death, in all of those 30-something years, he never again smiled. Never again smiled. The stories say that he was haunted by what he had seen in those 4 days of death, and that the joy of life regained was not enough to break through that experience. What sort of trauma and grief, what magnitude of suffering must he have experienced so as to be haunted by it through all his days, even having known his own resurrection? I think it must have been not just his individual death, but a culture of death, the kind of collective trauma at the hands of a system that cannot be unbound in one act. The kind of exposure to a magnitude of suffering that infiltrates every fiber of your being, that becomes the rhythm to which your blood flows. The kind of system that iterates upon itself, poisoning those who suffer and those who inflict the suffering, and the progeny of both. What I am saying is the kind of system such as slavery has been in this country.
Amen.
We are continuing our work of reparations, not as a side thought in this time of unnerving change and uncertainty, this time of pandemic, but because we understand that the culture of death in our country, which was born in slavery, is still far-reaching. We are seeing in the fallout of this pandemic the inequalities and injustices that the economic and social systems which slavery built are still alive and kicking today. The trauma of that time of death did not end with resurrection or with emancipation. Our people of African descent are still grappling with it every day, in every way. And we white people, we who have descended from the perpetrators and the privileged, we are carrying our own scars. Reparations is tender work, even in a world not being destabilized by a pandemic, because it requires us to look deeply at that culture of death. It requires us to go into the tomb with Lazarus, to see the pain and suffering, to not turn away. It requires us to inhabit our own grief in the way these systems have harmed us all and the ways in which they continue to do so. And that is hard work. It's vulnerable work. Lazarus never again smiled. But if we do the work of owning and meeting our own grief, of beginning to repair the world torn asunder by enslavement, we may begin to glimpse the joy that hovers and hides in the depths of loss and longing. Twice in this gospel passage, John tells us that Jesus was greatly distressed. He weeps. Though it appears he knew what was coming, he was told Lazarus was dying. He chose to stay away until after the actual death. He is visibly distressed by the death and by the suffering of Mary and Martha and those who loved Lazarus. He sees the ripple effects that extend beyond the individual loss. And perhaps also he sees the future suffering and the riptides of grief that have already begun. Jesus is no stranger to systemic oppression. In a short time, he himself will die a terrible death at the hands of empire. And he too is moved to a grief almost unbearable by the suffering of Lazarus and those around him. What this means to us is yet to be seen. Will we immerse ourselves in the river of loss that is our legacy? There are different griefs for each of us in having been born into and indoctrinated by a white supremacy culture, a culture of death. Those griefs demand an honest contemplation and an honest reckoning. We want no truck with cheap grace. What we want, I hope, we as a community and as the people of God, is to do the work of reparations, the work of repairing, so that we can emerge from a culture of death into one of abundant life. To own our grief, so that someday soon we may feel the truth in our bodies that love is stronger than death. Amen.